Okay, so we got the update on the Curriculum Advisory Council, and then we can kind of bounce back and forth between the policy agenda item. And at the June board meeting, we clarified that we were going to focus on any new at the Curriculum Advisory Council that occurred between the June meeting with Laura and Ramona and myself, Kylie, Beth, and Hector. The focus would be on PE waivers, any new course recommendations. We were going to look at the PE waiver policy and procedures, but not get into, after that group met, we talked briefly on graduation requirements, but an update was provided to the board on a Friday update that we're going to have to circle back and re-attack the graduation committee at a separate curriculum council, which is scheduled to occur, I believe, July 24th, if I'm not mistaken, or 22nd. I'm not sure of the date. It's happening before August.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Right? And that's going to be the focus of...
July 28th at 1 o'clock.
That will be the focus of grad requirements.
Yeah.
So if Kylie wants to provide a quick update on the overall curriculum council, and then we can jump into the PE discussion.
So when we met with the curriculum council, as Dr. Skinkus mentioned, we did discuss graduation requirements and some conversation from some board members that were, wanting us to look at taking a reduction there and lowering those a little bit, especially in the wake of ISB reducing requirements last semester because of the COVID-19 in quarter 4. I think that's probably what spurred that discussion. We also, at that meeting, took a look at, which is what we typically do at that meeting, is take a look at new courses that are being proposed through our leadership council to give the Board of Education an idea of what we would like to propose for the following school year that would be potentially changing something that goes into our curriculum guide. So we have one course that we are talking about with the Curriculum Advisory Council, and we were going to revisit that when we come back. The discussion about graduation requirements is certainly ongoing, and I know, with the statement that was shared earlier, I pulled some data, as well, so it's something that we are continuing to look at. The initial discussion about that was from, I would say, the building administrative side, and I think echoing Dr. Skinkus as well, would be to really be cautious not to drop graduation requirements any lower than what it would take to be a full-time student in this building. A student can take their minimum to be considered a full-time student every year is taking 5 courses. So anything that would be lower than that, which would equal out to a 20, we would not be in favor of as an institution that wants to be, as Ms. Haruska said, we're talking about being competitive and wanting to be able to say that we are a school that graduates competitive students that are able to go into whatever their next step is and be very successful at that. And I think as you want to do that, you have to consider the message that lowering graduation requirements sends, certainly. So there is a potential, to have a conversation about if we're looking at giving students more choice and more access to what their next steps are, and maybe even being able to advance that next step. Maybe the committee would consider, and potentially the board would consider, looking at removing some restraints that we put on our students within our graduation requirements before we would start hacking into the graduation requirements. A few years ago, when I was new to the district, one of the things that we had an organization that we used to work with do was put together some numbers that compare us to the top 10 schools in the state of Illinois. And we had some board members that really were interested in seeing how Riverside Brookfield stacks up against those top 10 schools. That's the best of the best, right, that we're talking about. So I went through and I pulled those top 10 school graduation requirements, and they sort of vacillate anywhere from the lowest, the lowest being Fremd High School at an 18.5, and then the next lowest, New Trier, is a 19. But you're upwards then when you're talking about schools like Neuqua Valley and Hinsdale Central, you're talking about graduation requirements that exceed ours at 24. What I noticed when I started printing these graduation requirements is that there aren't the number of constraints in a lot of these requirements that we put on our students in terms of that freedom of choice piece. If I'm a student who knows that I want to go into an apprenticeship when I leave high school, and I know that I want to take Mr. Weissar's automotives class, we're looking at the idea of being able to give that student that option. And, I certainly, heard what the RBA had to say, and certainly that's a consideration as well. Yes, we are people who are charged with giving our students a well-rounded education, but I think that this board has made very clear, in my mind, in the last few years, that we are also charged with supporting our students and preparing them for that next step, so that we don't have students who go to that next step and waste a semester in college like I did, going into something that I have no interest in, and I had no business being there. So I think that we have several responsibilities to our students, and that's why I think this conversation is ongoing and requires us to really be thoughtful in the why we would be looking to reduce graduation requirements, where I certainly would be someone who would be very, in favor of students having some less restrictions on them and being able to really explore what's important to them. And that's sort of why that conversation is ongoing, because it is a big thing to say we are going to go from 22 to potentially 20. We're essentially talking about 4 semester classes there. So it's not something that we're taking lightly, and we certainly want to be able to balance giving our kids opportunities and options, but also maintaining our status as a school that is really standing on its academic laurels and really having high expectations for students. And I think that we have to be careful as an administration of sending a message by reducing graduation requirements that says we're making it easier for kids to get through our building. And just make sure that we're balancing the needs of our students and what's appropriate for our students with what we're requiring them to take.
So, can I make a comment? Actually, I think it's important in this discussion to reframe it a little bit. I think the discussion we had in June, I was surprised to see so much discussion around reduction in graduation requirements, because that's not at all what I heard in June. I heard in June we had state changes that we had to adhere to. Is this a chance to look at the overall curriculum and do what you're describing here?
Mm-hmm.
How do people fit the pieces of the puzzle together?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't hear anyone saying, let's make this less rigorous. And I think that message needs to be kind of just course corrected a little bit. And maybe we need to review the curriculum. We need to look at all of the restrictions and the options and the potential, as opposed to we want to have a discussion about reduction of graduation requirements, because that to me is not it's certainly not where I am in this discussion.
Sure.
And I don't want to speak for anyone else, but I think that's an important nuance that we need to be careful of.
I mean, my understanding was maybe a little bit different than that. Okay. So I think maybe within the Board of Education there are differences, mm-hmm. right? Like of that view, right? Different sides of that view.
Can you give an example of like when you're saying removing restrictions or removing restraints or having less restrictions? Can you just give an example of restriction or restraint?
So, for example, and of course I printed out top 10 schools graduation requirements, but not ours, because that's just 2020 for you right now.
Tyler,
but,
you're going to eventually circle back to P. We're going to hit graduation more.
If you can jump in if I mess this up, answering her questions. For example, under our sort of extra requirements in terms of right outside of the English, the math, the science, the social studies requirements, and the PE requirements, we have very prescriptive requirements, for example, with cultural and global area studies, where a student has to take global area studies A, global area studies B. A student at RB has to take fine arts survey, so that's a semester within their schedule if they're not able to waive it. Whereas when I look at a graduation requirement like Hinsdale Central, they have their English, math, science, social studies requirements, their Consumer Act requirement, which is a state requirement, and their PE, and then they have a whole chunk that says elective arts. And students are able to select from 7 areas of elective courses in art, in business, in family and consumer science, in world languages, in music, and technology, all of those things to make up those 2 credits. Hinsdale is not saying to a student, you have to take this elective course, you have to take this one, and the rest of them are your choices. And we also talked very, I think at length about doing something similar to what Fremd High School does, whereas when they put their, and you don't have to see what's on it, but when they put their graduation requirements in their curriculum guide, they have the area of academic requirement, they have their graduation requirements, the state graduation requirements, and then they have community and college and career programs. This is how many are suggested. They have four-year colleges and universities. This is how many are suggested, as well as highly selective colleges and universities. So they have a chart that lays it out that could potentially address some of the concerns, like when Wendy was talking about the idea of a less informed student not being necessarily set up for success the same way. So that would be something that we would really want to look at, how we build potential models. I'm a kid who wants to go to this kind of school. This is what your 4 years here needs to look like.
And we currently have that in our curriculum guide. However, we no longer give students copies of the curriculum guide. Everything's online, and so much of the information is really just learned during the pre-registration meetings with counselors. So I just think we would do an even better job in making sure that students, when they're making their 4-year plan, that they're really they're made aware about which sort of pathway that they're going.
So Kylie, I would suggest that, for the August meeting, we're gonna obviously have a curriculum council meeting, but maybe we lay some more of this out, and we can get a little more into that. Ms. Aylis, I would say that I think there are some differing opinions on the board in regards to the graduation requirements. And I think we need to dive into that a little more in August.
Yeah, and I just want to say real quick, Dr. Skink, is that when we discuss in the curriculum committee, the idea of reducing graduation requirements never meant reducing, rigor or anything. It just meant opening options. Some students like to graduate at 3.5 years, take a half year at the community college, hit their college, their state college, save a little money. It just opened up options. It never meant reducing rigor. It's condescending to think that if we reduced requirements, our students would assume they could only take that. It's just, we believe our students have the highest ability to make good choices, and we're trying to give them more. So I didn't want anyone to think that.
All right, so we got some more discussing to do, and Kylie, I would bring back those documents, but I think what would be helpful if we provided a nice summary after the curriculum council for the board to have in their packet.
Yes.
Because today's conversation is to focus more on the PE waivers. So I just wanted to give a brief update from the curriculum council, so thank you for going into that a little bit.